It's strange how theater can come into being through sheer happenstance. Some time ago, a colleague of mine at the University of Florida created a theater piece based on oral histories about the first Black students at the university and the hardships they faced before and after integration. In addition to monologues, many scenes use the device of having two characters on stage. One would monologue about his or her experiences, while the other silently and passively held a recording device or wrote down their words. While having a conversation with my colleague in the hallway about his production, he casually mentioned something that showed up in his research. The Johns Committee, a little-known state-sponsored witch hunt to expel gay students and employees from its universities in the late 1950s. Fascinated by this little-known but obviously important moment in LGBT history and the history of the community in which I live, I set out to share these events on stage. It seemed an ideal time to engage in this material. There had been an escalating attacks from conservative quarters about gay rights in the US, which I saw as a backlash against the Supreme Court's narrowly decided decision in favor of recognizing same-sex marriage, and I felt this story needed to be told. Nevertheless, while the prospect of sharing this material was exciting, I remained conflicted about the efficacy of documentary theater. Once the fringe domain of agitprop, its attempts to reflect past events using such material as interviews, letters, and public records have become mainstream in the contemporary theatrical landscape. Critics and practitioners have framed it as nonfiction theater and found theater, as well as an alternative to received journalism, speaking to a distrust of mainstream media and the academic curation of history. Solo artists such as Anna Deavere Smith have created powerful works by going to sites of tragic events, interviewing hundreds of subjects surrounding the conflict, and portraying characters she chooses in monologue form. This has allowed her to recount stories of the Crown Heights and Los Angeles riots, genocide in Rwanda, AIDS in Africa, and most recently, the school-to-prison pipeline in the US. But perhaps the most well-known documentary theater piece is the Laramie Project, created by members of the Tectonic Theater Project. Using the same interview method, various actors portrayed residents of Laramie, Wyoming before and after the murder of Matthew Shepard, a young gay college student. Now, while Deavere and other practitioners can create a masterful evening due to their tremendous acting abilities, too often much documentary theater is static and runs counter to the theatrical form, a form which rewards dynamism. When anything is put on a stage, it becomes a kind of fiction, and the currency of the stage is symbolism. In fact, the most powerful documentary theater chooses and groups its subjects based on their symbolic value. Each character becomes a symbol of a viewpoint, a group, or a system. For example, to have one actor play all of the parts automatically creates a narrative that says our humanity is what unifies us, and that it's our social and political differences that allow us to stray from that reality. However, many plays of this type rely on the importance of the event to gloss over their inadequacies. Many are unengaging and fit into the category of plays you are not allowed to hate. To state that you did not enjoy the show is to somehow deny the painful experiences of those who lived them, or the importance of the historical moment. Many of the documentary plays I have seen or read seem to be representative of theater's inferiority complex. Not convinced that theater can create human truths on stage, we tell our audience that they must recognize truth because we are exactly reenacting history. If you can't point to an artist's artistic gloss, it must be truly authentic. Call this belief a way to address critic Walter Benjamin's essay, Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. If a work is a reproduction of the original, displaced from time and space, it loses what he called its aura. Now, to my eyes, documentary theater often tries to mediate this effect, to claim a right to an idea of authenticity. The most extreme example comes from director Mark Wing Davey, who pioneered the practice of having actors perform interviews while listening to them at the same time through headphones. While he claims that the performances become more authentic, it is certainly a signal to the audience that the play has somehow mastered the real. But what is real, and is it an achievable goal on stage? Shouldn't the theater's goal to be some form of truth? It was this aesthetic struggle with documentary theater that I struggled with while I set out to write my play that led me to a re-examination and re-evaluation of the form itself. I found several books that outline the Johns Committee story. Charlie Johns was a politician that represented a rural part of Florida that included Gainesville, the city in which the University of Florida resides. Despite a massive influx of new residents, voting districts had not changed for some time, and state senators such as Johns wielded immense power in contrast to the more populated areas of the state, such as the southern counties. After becoming lieutenant governor, he became acting governor of the state from 1953 to 1955. When he returned to being a state senator, he continued his anti-integrationist agenda by heading a committee called the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee, better known as the Johns Committee. Now, this committee sought to discredit the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People with claims that communists had infiltrated the organization. Now, this was a direct response to a boycott of segregated buses in the city of Tallahassee. There were even persistent rumors that Johns was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Finding no evidence to support his claims of communist control of black civil rights groups, Johns found that his committee needed a new mission to retain its power and its relevancy. When his son told him that the university had homosexual professors and students, Johns found a weaker enemy. He created a new initiative to root out homosexuality from the state, specifically at state universities. He began by hiring an investigator to work his way through the state, gathering evidence about homosexual culture, and with the aid of the university's president, they launched an investigation into their first target, the University of Florida, in the fall of 1958. Suspected professors and students were interrogated without counsel, both on and off campus, often for hours at a time, sometimes using campus police to take them out of class. Investigators were given access to campus health records, lavatory stalls were monitored, and students reported being followed. At least 2 students were paid to record the conversations of their peers and provided a list of suspected students to the committee. One university librarian volunteered a list of art books that she thought should be removed because she thought homosexuals would, quote, use them for their own purposes, unquote. The campus newspaper even volunteered to launch its own investigation into the presence of homosexuals on campus. Using the tactics of Senator Joe McCarthy's House Un-American Activities Committee from years earlier, if a student or professor's sexual status was confirmed, they would be told to name other homosexuals. Professors were unceremoniously fired, and students had the choice of seeking mental help or to drop out of school. It is estimated that 75 faculty and students were forced to leave or left of their own accord, but the number could be much higher. Once the work of the committee was completed, it moved to other schools. Only the University of Southern Florida pushed back against this invasion of privacy and violation of state laws. But what ultimately killed the power of the committee was its decision to publish its findings in a report called Homosexuality in Florida, a report of the Florida Legislative Committee. Meant to be a cautionary tale about homosexual encroachment, its frank language and photographs of men in bondage led many to denounce it as state-sponsored pornography. In fact, one bookstore in New York was selling reprints to its gay clientele. First, the lawyers resigned from the committee, and later Johns himself, rendering the committee irrelevant. For my research, I consulted works that discuss state politics of the time, being gay in the 1950s, the social culture of the university, and even the music and slang popular during that time. However, scholarly works and searching newspaper articles only presented part of the story. The most revelatory experience was when I traveled to Tallahassee to read the transcripts of the interrogations. The records had been sealed for some time, but recently opened to the public. They were inherently dramatic and often heartbreaking, but I could not construct a show around interrogations. Since there was a commonality in the questioning, the show would become too repetitive and would only tell part of the story. I also thought the scope would be too narrow. I thought it was not only important to show the forces that led to the committee's formation, the will to impose personal prejudice through government, but also to specifically show the hostile environment that gay students and professors had to endure during that time. I was also deeply moved by the letters of a gay professor named Sigismund Dietrich, which were in a special collection in our library. Dietrich was a married geology professor who had been named, interrogated, and dismissed. Taking 85 aspirins, he went to the top of the university tower, determined to jump. He changed his mind at the last minute and, according to his letters, was surprised not to be abandoned by his friends. This inserted some hope into an otherwise bleak set of circumstances. There were no lengthy interviews with any UF students that were affected by the Johns Committee, and only a few quotes and letters from Charlie Johns himself, his investigator, and the university president. Therefore, based on the material available, I decided to create a hybrid form, both documentary and fictional, telling 3 intertwining stories. I created a student out of composite accounts and showed him before and after he was affected by the committee. I wrote scenes where he interacted with a roommate who was spying on him and a girlfriend who didn't understand him. I wrote scenes with Charlie Johns himself as a character and a young lawyer who sells his soul to John's ruthless moral crusade. Beginning with a scene between the two of them and University President Reitz allowed me to show how the committee gained power and then lost it. Johns was a classic example of an opportunist who craves power, hates the media, intellectual discourse, and uses fear to trample on human rights. Sound familiar? Finally, I included scenes with Sigismund Dietrich interacting with the student I created. As the centerpiece of the play, I included a verbatim section of Dietrich's interrogation before the committee, where he was emotionally torn apart. To wrap the piece into a theatrical shell, I had an older, unnamed man introduce the piece. In the last scene, the audience discovers that the man who introduced and helped to physically set up certain scenes is the student, as a middle-aged man trying to make sense of his past, and the two of them had a scene, the older and younger self, at the end. And as much as I could, I tried to stay true to the events and attitudes that had shown up in my research. Finally, the play had a reading at the Hippodrome Theater in Gainesville, and in 2019 was presented at the American Theater of Actors in New York City. The feedback was both very positive and very troubling. When I pressed people who had seen the play what they liked about it, instead of talking about engaging characters, scenes, or the overall writing, all would report that it was a very interesting piece of history, or they expressed their shock that the events really happened. Perhaps our dedication to what is true will always eclipse the poetic values of a play, but I will always hold fast to the idea that it's the artist's job to interpret, not report history. And when history's documents cannot tell the whole story, it is up to the artist to fill in the blanks. I think our first responsibility is to the truth, in whatever form it takes. And our second responsibility is to the theatrical form.